Fashion is an ancient expression of who we are as individuals, as a community, and as a culture.
We are influenced by the world around us, finding inspiration in the natural worlds of colors and designs, in a community's culture, and in other people we encounter. Let's go to Carly Kohler at the American Indian Film Festival, where she ran into Eddie Madril.
We're here today with Eddie Madril to talk about his fashion show, Indigenous Couture. What inspired you to have the fashion show?
The fashion show was something that really came to fruition because they were having a Jean-Paul Gaultier exhibit at the De Young. I had been interested in fashion for like 30 years just because I think clothing really expresses a people. And for Native people, for a lot of Indigenous people around the world, it really expresses internally and externally who we are, how we feel, where we come from. And I think for Native people, clothing isn't just something that's utilitarian. It's not something that's just for utility. It's something that has a meaning and a purpose. It expresses beauty and power. And I just wanted to kind of try my hand at, doing something that would represent us in a contemporary and a modern light. Can we do something like that, represent our people well, without, adhering or buying into some stereotype? Because a lot of times, any culture, whether it's religious, ethnic, social, sometimes it's the people themselves that perpetuate a stereotype. So I was just trying to see what I could come up with.
What was your vision when you were putting these costumes together?
As a vision, I just wanted to see what can I do with material. I think what happens when fashion designers are making things, they're designing things that they can sell. And then when you go to a fashion show like, Fashion Week, down in LA, New York, Milan, I think fashion designers really want to try their hand at what can they do with this type of material? How can they, make it stretch, bend? Can they sew it in certain ways? And I was like, well, I've never done it, but let's try it. And I artistically started imagining myself, well, if Native people and European people got along a little bit more cohesively in the late 1800s, what would fashion look like had they put their ideas together? So one of my motivations was, well, what could I do that would kind of represent when I think fashion was really, really prominent in Europe, which was in the late 1800s. I think when you look at fashion in the 1700s, 1800s, I think it's just, it's beautiful. It's so ornate. There's so much embellishment. There's, so much beauty. And I guess the motivation was to see, well, what would it look like? And what could we do now to challenge what looks like stereotypes and to challenge what people think we look like? So I think a lot of times when we represent ourselves, we're not exactly sure what we're supposed to do in a modern light, knowing that our Native brothers and sisters are going to look at it and go, well, what are you doing? Why are you doing it that?
Were you worried about that, or did you think this was a good step for Native people to have this fashion show?
I didn't worry. I kind of anticipated the challenges, the questions, and I would never have taken them abrasively or aggressively. I would have thought, okay, so this is starting the dialogue. This is starting the narrative of what's important to us now. I can express myself as an artist, but it's also up to other people, us as a Native community, to decide what's right and what's wrong. So if other people are going to do it, I'm going to be a critic. If I'm going to do it, others are going to be the critic. So how do we start a dialogue? So rather than me doing something and leaving and just kind of exiting, what do you think? Is it right? Is it wrong? And this is what makes it really, really valuable for other people who are non-Native to understand why we choose to do what we do. The ideas, for the most part, everything on paper was mine, but other people really contributed their own ideas, their own artistry, their own talents to a lot of the designs. We opened up the show with a lot of traditional clothing. It wasn't up to me to decide which clothing would be okay. I decided to pick people from different regions of the United States to represent themselves. I didn't tell people it had to be from the 1800s, very traditional. You represent you. How dare I tell somebody that they have to be 1850s Cherokee, 1700s Yaqui or something like that. So I just asked the people to represent themselves the best way that they could.
I really appreciate that perspective on that. I think you mentioned this, you handmade some of them?
Some of them I was hand making about an hour before the show started. But I think it's typical Native. A lot of people, Native and non-Native, really contributed to putting them together. Either I was sewing, my wife was sewing, my brother was sewing, my mother-in-law was sewing, my mother was sewing. We were all sewing and putting things together. Yeah, they're all friends and family. I wasn't, looking to audition or go out and do these things. Now, if I have to do that at some point, if we have this keep on growing, that's fine. But I wanted it to be a real, family project.
What do you see yourself doing in the future? Are you going to have more fashion shows, or do you want to take it a different direction? Is there anything you want to change?
Fashion show we did wasn't a typical fashion show. There was still more like historical, political, academic, and kind of like theatrical aspects to it. I still wanted it to be a storytelling, performance, a storytelling presentation. So to do it again, yes, and just have a different way of just telling the story about clothing, the importance, and what it means. A lot of the things I did were really for art.
I just thought it was really a great idea. I want to actually throw you a hardball now. No Doubt did a piece of taking Native culture, appropriating it a little bit. So I wanted to ask you, how would you have seen that situation, and how is your fashion show different?
By the time we found out about it and got to it, it had already been taken off. According to the write-up, they went and asked, some Native people a little bit more about what they did. And I think that's valid. I think that's really good. Some people think that it wasn't enough, but the question then becomes, well, what is enough? What's going to satisfy people? What they did is very similar to what a lot of people have been doing for the past 100 years, 150 years. The idea is, well, we're trying to, say that we really, idolize, these Native people. I think what they did was purely for art and purely to perpetuate this idea that, it's okay to go ahead and do these things, taking ideas that they think are kind of neat and kind of cool. It's gimmicky, it's a novelty, it's something that you can just go ahead and use. I mean, it's the same thing as appropriation. How is it different from what I did? Some might say, well, what I did is authentic because I am Native. But some people would say, well, it's still no different because you were modernizing. I had a reason and a purpose behind everything that I did. So if it was questioned why I did this piece or why I did this piece or why I did this piece, there's a reason and a purpose for each one of those. Whereas I think for the Gwen Stefani No Doubt video, I think a lot of that was just to kind of be different, unique, kind of have a theatrical novelty to it, to be very attractive in the video, to, in that kind of industry is really to go ahead and compete with other people doing something similar. I think my Native brothers and sisters who are out there doing fashion, it's great. We're going to be questioned, and we're going to be questioning what we're doing. And I think what's important is that we have some, validation behind what we're doing, and it's not just, a gimmick, a novelty.
I think it's amazing what you're doing, and I think it's a really great avenue to allow other people to learn more about Native culture in a modern setting.